welcome back. So picking up from where we stopped yesterday, we're going on to 1 Kings 17 to 19, and I'm very happy to be sharing the lessons that I learned from reading those chapters. We're now introduced to Elijah the prophet from Tishbe. Although the exact location of Tishbe is unknown, it is said to be the Israelite territory, an Israelite territory. So from what we understand, Elijah is now the first true prophet from Israel, because I can never say that word, hitherto. Okay, yes, hitherto. we only have met prophets of Baal from there. So after his confrontation with Ahab and Jezebel, he was sent by God to hide by the brook Cherith, where the ravens fed him during the drought that he had predicted. When the brook dried up, God commanded him to go to Zarephath to stay with a widow whom he had commanded. Now, I underlined that in my notes because it was something that just really came through to me, that God had commanded the widow in Zarephath. Obviously, we all know this story. We've heard it many times. But this was the first time that I knew that, God had actually commanded her. And don't forget that Zarephath was in Sidonian territory, the territory of Tyre and Sidon, which was outside of Israel. So he had commanded the widow to take care of him. She was Phoenician. God commanded Elijah that his well-being depended on him. I don't know why I commanded. God demonstrated to Elijah that his well-being depended on him. That's God alone. He'd essentially sent him to a poor widow who had almost nothing, but she was willing and obeyed Elijah's request to feed him first. Now, thinking about that must have taken a whole lot of faith from that lady, because imagine, even if she wasn't thinking about herself, she was thinking about her son. God rewarded her with miraculous provision throughout the drought. When the widow's son got sick and died, the woman essentially blamed Elijah. But it's actually a saving grace that he was there to ask God to rescue the boy, because if he wasn't there and the boy had died and fallen sick, then who knows? After 3 years of drought in Israel, God sent Elijah back to Ahab. Elijah and Ahab's confrontation revealed the true conflict within Israel. And that conflict wasn't between just Elijah and Ahab, it was between God and the false gods. So it was basically, that was the showdown, that needed to happen. And Elijah proposed that showdown between the 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. He lets the people know that they cannot continue to sit on the fence, where their worship was concerned. They couldn't keep worshiping God and Baal, because that was what was happening in those days. Their hearts were divided, So Jezebel was the one who had brought in the fanatical worship of Baal from her hometown in Tyre and Sidon, and that was one of the things that I did pick up about, who you marry or who you yoke yourself with, because this fanatical worship, as the woman and the queen, she had the authority to be able to institute those kind of things. Of course, the showdown didn't go well for the prophets of Baal, as we know, as they are first disgraced by their false gods, and then they are killed by the people at Elijah's behest. The people acknowledged God's power when, at Elijah's prayer, fire came down from the heavens and consumed the sacrifice and everything in its vicinity. It was only after this great act of God that the drought ended. Elijah demonstrated great faith in God as he kept sending his servant back to check for the clouds that will bring the rain. So imagine what it must have been like for him. He had to go back 7 times. It shows that sometimes, you see, when we pray for things and we feel, we need to see it now, sometimes it's not immediate. Look at Elijah 7 times, and he had just done this great act. He asked God for one time, and the fire came 1 time. But for the cloud that would bring the drought, his servant had to go back 7 times. If that doesn't tell you persistence, I don't know what else does. So imagine going back 7 times before he finally saw the cloud the size of a man's fist before the rain finally came. Did you wonder why Elijah, powerful prophet of God, who had just concluded this amazing, miraculous act of God, 2 mighty acts of God, in fact, back to back, was terrified by Jezebel's message in 19:2? Now, I wondered about that too. But do you know the explanation that I got? Elijah was tired and he felt alone. And to be honest, you can be as strong as, determined for God and doing mighty things. But if you don't rest, and if you don't have community or have the people that you feel are with you, going along with you, it's easy to feel dejected and depressed. Elijah's experience with God on Mount Horeb is similar to Moses's. Did you notice? They both spent 40 days without food, fasting. Elijah traveling to Horeb and Moses on the mountain with God. They both hid from God's presence, Elijah in the cave and Moses in the cleft of the rocks. They both experienced God's presence and were given messages from God in instances where Israel had deserted God to worship pagan gods. I found that very interesting to just find that parallel between both their stories. God commanded Elijah to anoint 2 future kings of Israel, or 2 future kings. Hazael was the king of Syria and Jehu the king of Israel, and Elisha as prophet, who eventually succeeded him. Even though Elijah had lamented to God earlier in 19:10 that he was the only prophet zealous for him, forgetting the 100 prophets that Obadiah had hidden in the cave from Jezebel, God let him know that he had reserved 7,000 prophets who hadn't worshipped Baal. Now, 7,000 when you think that you're alone. And this is just something that comes through to me when I think about how, single people say, oh, there's nobody left. Yeah, all the good men are taken or all the good women are taken. Elijah thought he was the only one left, but there were 7,000 that God had reserved for himself. So take heart. There are a lot more of you than you think there are. So now let me share my hashtag getting to know God lesson. God teaches us to trust him even in the most dire circumstances. The widow of Zarephath wasn't an Israelite who knew or worshipped Yahweh, but she learned to trust God in those days. From yielding her heart to him, obeying the prophet, and even trusting that her dead son would rise again, as she trusted him to Elijah, who by the power of God raised him. I loved how in 17:12, while responding to Elijah's request, she said, "As the Lord your God lives." That means she recognized and acknowledged God. So I don't know about you, but for me, my whole thing in this season is just trusting God. That's all I'm just praying for and being conscious of doing. And I hope you will too. Learn to trust God. Thank you for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow with lessons from 1 Kings 20 to 21, and I look forward to seeing you. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.